Hello people, in this lecture we're going to start building our infrastructure layer. Let's create a new class library to place our database related code. Let's say class library net restaurant dot infrastructure. Delete the starter class. We're gonna place all the database related files in this layer. So let's create our DB context. Let's create a new class for application DB context. So if we're gonna use this layer as our database related code, we're gonna install the entity framework packages in this layer. Let's add the entity framework packages. Let's add entity framework core, the same version as you're using in your project. Let's install the entity framework tools, the SQL server provider, accept, okay. Let's go to our application DB context and inherit from DB context. Let's import from Microsoft Entity Framework Core. Make it public so we can access it outside our class library. Create a constructor, and as we've already seen in the last session, we're gonna pass an options with the name of our DB context, and we're gonna pass these options to the base of our class. Let's create our DB sets. Let's say public DB set for category, but as you can see, we don't have access to our category entity, so we're gonna add a project reference. We'll add to the infrastructure. I misspelled here is infrastructure. I will rename it later. If you see, I will add a project reference to the core of our application, but we cannot add this dependency, this project reference in the core. So our core, our domain will be the higher layer of our project. Let's change it to infrastructure. Now it's correct. Now I can import our namespace category, and I say categories. Let's copy down. Let's say dish, dishes, order, orders, user, users. Now we're gonna use in our repositories, we're gonna implement the CRUD operations for all our entities. But let's use a common pattern when we are using a clean architecture. In the core, we can place our interfaces. An interface is a contract. That means all the methods that I said in that contract will have to be implemented in the child class. Let's create a new folder in our core. Let's say interfaces, and I will place an interface for repository. Let's say repository. This will be a public interface, and this interface will be a generic interface, so we can use it for all our repositories. Let's say I will have get that will retrieve our entity. I will have a list of our entity. To get all our entities, I will have a create that will return my object. Let's say creates, and I will pass my entity. I'll have an update. It's basically the same thing. And a delete that will retrieve a boolean. With this interface, when I create a repository, if I inherit from this interface, I'll have to implement all these methods. Let's create an infrastructure. Let's create a new folder in the infrastructure layer for repositories. Let's create a repository for our user. Let's create a new class, user repository. This user repository will be a public class that will inherit from our repository. And to my generic type, I will pass my user entity. If you see here, I'll have this error saying that these methods were not implemented in my class. Let's implement this interface. And if you see, when I create a user, I will retrieve a user. In my generic repository, I was retrieving our generic type. But as this is a repository, I will have to access my context. Let's get my context here. I will create a read-only property, and it will be my application DB context. If I right click here in quick actions and refactoring, I can generate my constructor. So every time when I instantiate my user repository, I will have access to my context in the creation of it. In the create method, I will say context users add my entity. I will save the changes and return my entity. With a delete, first I'll have to get my user. Let's use our get method and pass my ID. If the user is null, I will return false because my user cannot be found. If it's not, I will remove it from my database and I will save the changes. And return it true. Yes, my user was deleted. With the get, let's get my user with first. With get all, let's say I will return my user. With get all, let's return my context users to list. With the update, let's go to our context users update. Let's update, save the changes, not async, and return our entity. Now I've already implemented my interface, but this isn't a good practice because if you see here, all my methods are synchronous. How can we implement it asynchronous? So with asynchronous, I can have multiple code running and my application can be more performatic. If you want to see that, see you again in the next lecture.